What's going on, everyone? Matt, aka Martillon here. I just recently released a new tune called It's All You featuring the amazing Kathana, which is out now on all streaming platforms, all your favorite platforms and everything. You can go listen to it right now. But if you haven't heard it yet, here's a quick little snippet. So what I thought would be a really cool idea for today is to just go through the Ableton Live session, break down the track, and go through all the different little bits and components in it and show you how it's made up so that you can learn some stuff, learn how the track was put together, and maybe use some of the tips and techniques that I show you in your own productions. So if you haven't heard the full tune yet, make sure to go and listen to it. Link will be down in the description below, and then come back here and watch the rest of the video. So without any further ado, let's jump into the Ableton Live session and show you how I made the track. All right, cool. So here we are in the Ableton Live session. As you can see, as with my previous track breakdowns, we're just going to go through the session basically from start to finish, starting with the intro and ending up with the second drop, and then just going through the different elements that get introduced along the way. So let's start with the first verse / intro. I'll play this for you, and then we'll pick apart the different elements that make it up. Cool. All right. So the first element we'll pick apart is the drums. As you probably heard, the drums are filtered throughout this first kind of little part here. So it's just a kick and a snare going on, and the two of them together sound like this. And so all I've done here is just on the kick channel, I've got a little bit of a high pass filter going on the kick, and then also after a bunch of stuff, a low pass filter just to filter out some of that top end as well. So you get this kind of band pass filtered kick, just as a way of, introducing the drums in the intro a little bit. And then the same thing is going on with the snare as well, except I don't have a high pass filter. I believe I just have that same low pass filter automated with its frequency control just at the end of the chain there. And then beyond that part there into the second part of this verse, we have that filter goes away and we get the full drums. And really all that's introduced is just a crash cymbal or two different crash cymbals that kind of help to just signal little breaks and kind of new parts and keep the drums a little bit interesting. So altogether, the drums for this part sound like this. As you would have noticed, every kind of second main snare hit that's also layered with this kind of reverbed out clap sound. So we have this sound right here that makes it sound, just gives it a little bit of extra texture, which is layered with the main snare. And so you probably would have heard that there happening here, here, and here. And also we just have a fairly basic kind of standard drum pattern. And there's some delay and reverb and stuff on the crashes as well. So moving on from the drums, let's dive into the synths. Now you'll notice that I've got a few different layers here. This piano layer is not actually being played. This is just kind of like a chords layer that I played in when I was trying to figure out the chords. I should probably mute that or just get rid of that. But here are the main verse chords, which are just an analog patch, which I'll really quickly show you how I made. There's just this basic kind of analog supersaw sound going on with some extra kind of processing, some EQ, some, what have I got? A frequency shifter there, which is just kind of adding a little bit of like movement to the pitch on occasion between the left and right speakers. Gives it a little bit of width and a little bit of kind of warbliness, some compression, some phasing for some more of that kind of warbly sound, then delay, compression, EQ, and I think that's a reverb. Yep, cool. And just all adding to this overall kind of really cool, plucky, warbly, warm synth sound, which by itself sounds like this. And of course, the filter is opening up over the course of this intro as well. as you can see down here. Pretty cool, and then it starts to get sidechained by the drums as well. And in this second part of the verse, we've layered it with this electric key sound, which is by Addictive Keys, and basically it's just kind of using addictive keys in there. I won't unfreeze this now either, but this by itself sounds like this. Playing a different voicing to the original chords or the main kind of synth chords, and just adding a little bit of extra texture to the chord sound, just to kind of give it a little bit more weight, give it a little bit more interest. But in the grand scheme of things, you can't really hear it too much. So it sounds like this without the keys and with the keys. Cool. So it just gives it a little bit of extra weight, a little bit of extra mid-range, just to help kind of beef up the sound a little bit. Then we have this reverse kind of, all these big verse chords that I've called them, which are just kind of opening up towards the end of the verse into the build-up. And then let's dive into the next part, which is the bass. Now, really just a simple bass going on here. There's just long notes. I think I've just made some kind of basic patch in operator. I've just reduced some of the second and third harmonics. I think I probably had it as like a sawtooth wave or something, and then I just started playing around with it. And really, that's kind of it. I've got some chorus on the mid band, but that's all. And this bass sounds like this. So it's kind of like got that wubby, almost like kind of old school analog synth type sound, where it's got that filter opening up with some filter attack and then that kind of shorter decay, which sounds pretty cool. So then the next part of the intro, which is kind of the focal point, are these vocal chops, which are just taken from the, I think, first verse actually. And I literally just played around with just the different slices of this vocal until I found some kind of pattern that I really liked. So all I did was, after I'd edited the vocals, I just dragged them into a MIDI track, into a simpler, and then I chucked the simpler onto slice mode, as you can see over here, turned it onto gate. So basically what gate does is it means that it will stop playing the sample when there's a note off MIDI message. So whenever you let go of the note, it'll stop playing the slice, as opposed to playing it all the way through if it's just on trigger mode. And then I just played around with some different slicing and obviously transposed it up a whole octave. Added some nectar, which I don't entirely remember what that's doing, some de-essing, some basic EQing. I think it's just getting rid of some of the harsh S sounds, and then some compression, EQ, OTT, some delay, reverb, some further EQ, some further compression, some side chaining, and then another kind of side chain simulator thing here, which is just giving it a little bit of bounce consistently, and then some filtering for the start here, again having that kind of bandpass type sound before it opens up all the way in the choruses or in the drops. And so introducing this at the start is just a way to kind of tease it before it ends up coming in the drops and being a real kind of focal point of these drops. So these vocal chops by themselves sound like this. Pretty cool, pretty nice little pattern, and it's kind of going back and forth between the left and right speakers as well. So it's just got some nice kind of stuff there. So I think it's probably also being randomly panned or auto panned or something. It's got a random pan value, on the simpler in the where the vocal chops are. So this is just being automated so that it pans randomly between the left and the right speakers for the start of the intro, which just gives it a little bit more kind of width and stereo placement. And then the main vocals, the event, comes in at the second part of this first verse here. Now the vocal processing for this wasn't too intense. These are just different delays going on here. They're not really wild, but I have a gate just to get rid of some of that background noise. I had taken this all into a different DAW Studio One and used that to kind of level out the gain of each of the different vocal phrases so that I didn't have to do too much work with the compression, etc. And then I have a nectar here, which is just a de-esser basically, followed by a compressor just to catch any kind of extraneous peaks, a vocal doubler to give it some more width, and then another nectar which is doing the bulk of the work here, which has some pitch correction going on. Maybe in the first one, I believe there's some kind of auto-tuney stuff going on. There's an EQ, a de-esser. I just accidentally changed that. Another EQ, compressor, and some saturation. And I believe I probably just started using the vocal assistant, then after that just kind of tweaked it to my liking, followed by some EQ and some multiband dynamics just to kind of level out the frequencies a little bit, and then some delays, which are my kind of personal delay return racks that if you sign up to my mailing list, you can download if you want. But these are really useful for basically having kind of a delay send, but as an insert on the track. And then I've got some volume automation going on as well. As you can see, here's all the automation going on for all the other tracks too. And so these main vocals, just by themselves, there's some EQ on the group as well, sounds like this.
Our lives caught in the rain, and we're never going back to all the things that they say, telling us our dreams will never last.
Cool. I think that probably sounds a little bit different. I think I must have mucked with some of the Nectar settings or something, but cool. So that's what the main vocals sound like. They kind of have some Nectar and stuff going on there as well. So let's now dive into, and there's just this tiny little reverse effect here, which just leads into the verse where the main vocals come in. All right, so let's now dive into the build-up. Now, the build-up is a little bit kind of different. There's got some different chords and stuff going on. There's basically entirely new stuff going on in the build-up, or things that we haven't heard quite yet. So first of all, we have some kicks just kind of as impacts, really. I think... Nope, there's no filtering or anything going on there. They're just basically kicks, and I've got them copied in my sidechain trigger channel up the top there, which basically is just using to trigger the sidechain on all of my synths and instruments that are being sidechained to the kick drum and other drums. So that's just a sidechain trigger up there, which is useful and kind of a pretty standard practice. And then we have these build drums here, so these claps get introduced right at the start of this build up, which sound like this, being automated in volume. And then they start to be layered with some snares as well. So all these build drums together. Cool. So get faster, they get filtered, and it doesn't look like they get transposed at all. Generally, I'll also transpose the drums, but I decided not to this time for some reason. But I did use a frequency shifter on the main build drums as basically just pitching them up, as well as using a high pass filter to kind of roll out all of that low end in those build drums as well. Just kind of build up more tension towards this kind of pre-drop area before the drop. So those are all the build drums, and there's some crashes going on there as well. I think there's some new crashes. So there's a different kind of crash sound here, which gets led into by this reverse crash. And also that first build snare gets introduced with this reverse of that same kind of snare sound. Really simple kind of, but effective stuff. So let's now move on to the synths in the build-up. There's really only one synth going on in the build-up. The rest of it is kind of all vocals. There's a lot of space taken up by the vocals. So there's this one main build synth here, which is my favorite, all-time favorite Super Supreme preset, which is this really basic preset that you'll probably see me use all the time. It's this preset that I built inside of Sylenth. It's basically just a really simple super saw patch, which is really useful, that I then alter and just change to suit whatever the track is that I'm working on. It's got some basic EQ and some compression, which is just being sidechain compression, and then some other stuff, and it's having its filter, amount, and cutoff frequency automated so that it kind of builds up towards the end of the build up here. And this synth sounds like this. Cool, and you notice I using a lot of kind of extended chords, so sevenths and ninths and stuff like that, just to add some extra kind of flavor to the chords from a musical perspective. I won't go through exactly what the chords are, but if you want to pause the video and work that out, you can do that right here. But let's now dive into the next part. So we have some sub drops here, which are just kind of, adding to some impact, really basic sub drop that just sounds like this. And that just repeats another 2 times in this build-up with some volume automation towards the end of it so that there's not like a little click at the end, which is really useful and doesn't kind of linger around for longer than necessary. So using some volume automation on these sub drops is a really good way to just make sure that they last for basically only as long as you want them to last. And then we have, of course, some more vocals. So we have our main lead vocal track here, which doesn't change in terms of its processing or anything at all. We have different send amounts and stuff going on here. So there's some delay send on the end of here, just to kind of extend out that word. And then I'm not sending it to any of our delay tracks, our delay return tracks here for the first part, and then re-automating it to send back to the delay return tracks there. So obviously it's being delayed in the verse as well. And then we have some pre-chorus double sound. So this is just a double, which is basically being, I think, much more heavily tuned, just to give it a little bit of a different kind of sound so that there's no weird phasing issues or anything like that. Followed by some nectar, which I assume is probably just some de-essing and some saturation. And then some much more intense EQ just to differentiate it a little bit from the main vocals. So this little vocal double sounds like this.
And we keep running this together. And we keep running this forever.
So it just gives a little bit more kind of thickness to the main vocal. And then I've got these kind of little delay throws with the harmonies here, which sound pretty cool. Pretty cool, just kind of adding in some harmonies on those like main lines there, which altogether those vocals sound pretty cool. They sound like this.
And we keep running this together. And we keep running this forever. And we keep
So it's just a cool way to kind of accentuate those lines. And then the end of that line, I have a pitched down version of the main vocal, just to give it a little bit of extra, oomph and just change it up a little bit, which is pretty cool. And then we have a bunch of chorus doubles here. So it was awesome. Kathana sent me a bunch of chorus doubles, which really helped to thicken up the lead vocals, and some ad-libs as well. So all these are being pretty basically group processed, essentially just running through Nectar and some EQ8. I don't really heavily process individual vocals when they're in a stack like this because they're all being treated as essentially a single instrument anyway. The only time I might is if there's some phasing or whatever and I want to just try and separate them a little bit more. You might be able to detune them or something like that, which can just help to separate them a little bit more. But this time they're all kind of acting as a single instrument. And then I have these chorus ad-libs here as well, which are just saying this, which I've layered with a higher version here, as you can see, and the main version here. And these are pretty much using the exact same processing as the main lead vocal. And altogether, this vocal stack sounds like this.
Don't let go of anything, it's on you. It's on you. Don't let go of anything, it's on you. It's on you.
And then all that we've got in the rest of the build-up are just some rises, really, that are just going throughout the entirety of it, just to build up some extra tension and stuff. You don't really need to hear them, but this is what they sound like towards the end of it. Just some basic rises. I often don't do my own kind of riser sound design. I'll just bring in some stuff and then EQ and compress it just to make it a little bit different and just make it suit the track a little bit more. Cool. So then we have this like pre-drop, which is really just a basic, 2 bars with a fill at the end just to add a little bit of extra tension. So we have this fill that sounds like this. Pretty cool. And then we move on to the main meat of the track, which kind of comes out of nowhere. It's a little bit of a contrast, which I quite like, is the drop. So starting with the drums in the drop, we change up the snare from the snare that we used in the verse. We make it more of kind of like a dubstep-y style snare. So it sounds like this, as opposed to that kind of trap-like snare that we had back in the verse. So it just gives it a little bit kind of extra, different sound there, which is kind of cool. And then we have our same kick drum. I don't think there's a lot of automation or anything going on there. We also, of course, have our sidechain trigger up the top here, which is now introducing the snare as part of that sidechain trigger as well. And then there's not a lot else going on in the drums for that first part of the drop. We have some layered crashes here, but that's really it. And then we start to introduce some more layers towards the later part of the drop. We have this pop snare kind of layer, which sounds like this, which is essentially just a snare that I've got some repitching on and also doing some panning to kind of change its left and right positioning to just give it a little bit of extra movement. Now the panning I'm doing with this, I'm not actually using a pan, but the sample was kind of panned a little bit to the left, and I didn't want to just use the balancing, and I didn't want to muck around with kind of stereo pan. So all I did, I just have a utility here that I just swap the left and the right sides, the left and the right signals. And essentially, because this sounds more left than it does right, when I swap the left and the right signals, it sounds more right than it does left. So it's just a really good way of, without using panning, you can just kind of automate this utility here. If you have a sound that is more left or right heavy, you can just automate a utility with the swap to make it sound the other speaker heavy. And then we have some hi-hats and shakers, which we've layered towards the end here, that are just playing some different patterns. They're panned, so we have a hi-hat on the left speaker and a shaker in the right speaker, and they're both being compressed in a group, and they all together sound like this. And you'll probably notice that they're quite kind of unquantized, again, quite on purpose. They're not entirely on grid. They were moved off grid intentionally just to give it a little bit more kind of swing and groove. And then we have these build drums kind of come back in towards the end here to just kind of signify the transition into the next verse. So all these drums, I'll just play the drums of the second part of the drop here, sound like this. Pretty cool, and just a great kind of little background to the main elements, which are, of course, our synths. So the synths in this drop are made up of a few different layers. There's 5 different layers here, and this is basically using the technique that I use pretty much all the time when I layer my chord stacks, which is have a few different layers, and I've gone through this technique in a previous video. So if you haven't seen that one, go check it out. I think it's how to use chord stacks or make chord stacks or something like that. And there's a main stabs here, which is just that super supreme sound layered with a top line, which is essentially playing the top line of these chords or the melody of these chords, which is a different sound. And then we have a main chord layer, which is kind of like a middle layer, which I generally use like a square wave for, just to add a little bit more body to the main stab sound. Then I have this piano layer, which is a really kind of compressed, heavily EQ'd, just high piano sound. So you get that kind of transient at the start of each of the chords with this piano sound going on here, and then layered with some noise. I like using noise as a separate layer just to blend in with the main synth sound a little bit easier, so that you can kind of control it a little bit better. And it's really just some high passed noise, and all this sounds like together is this. Pretty cool. As you can see, there's a bunch of group processing going on as well. We have some EQ, some OTT, some more EQ, some track spacer, which is being used to essentially carve out room for the vocals when these synths come in later with the vocals. So that's obviously not being used at the moment. And then some other stuff. There's that pitch drop, as you would have heard, and some filters just to automate and create some differences. So like, for example, this part here, we have some kind of filter movement, which is pretty cool and helps just kind of move things along a little bit there. We also have this melody layer pluck sound just to accentuate that kind of little layer fill, which sounds like this. It's not really hugely audible in the final kind of grand scheme of things, but it just adds a little bit of extra kind of intention to that little fill there. So it's really useful just to have as an extra layer. And then we have our main drop bass, which is essentially just an operator with a saw that's being FM'd a little bit and some EQ to cut out the low end and layered with a sub sound. So really nothing hugely crazy going on there. And these, of course, are all being sidechained as well. And then we have that same pitch drop going on just to mimic what the chords are doing, make it all sound a little bit more intentional. And this bass sounds like this. And of course that layers really well with the synths, which all together, those basses and synths, sound like this. You'll probably hear some clicking from the sidechain there. I know some people like to use the Live 8 compressor to like avoid that clicking. I don't mind it too much. It kind of blends in with the transients of the drums and helps to actually make them a little bit punchier and more transient-y in some cases. So I don't mind that one too much, but occasionally, that clicking does get in the way. And then we also have some little really basic kind of wub sounds here. We have this one, which is the first one, just acting as a bit of a fill. Really, really basic, which is actually, I think, being made in Wavetable. And then we have this second one, which is, I think, essentially a copy of that first one, just processed and EQ'd slightly differently, which sounds like this, which is kind of cool. And then we have our vocal chops that come back in towards the second half of the drop, which end up being kind of like the drop melody, the focal point of the drop. These, of course, are unfiltered, but we do have some kind of automation that sends them to delay right at the end, so they kind of delay out over the start of the next verse, and then some auto pan and some filter automation as well as volume automation just towards the end to kind of help balance it out and create some more interest towards the end of that build up. We don't need to play them again, you've heard them already, but actually we will, so you can hear them unfiltered. And then we have just some basically vocal fills essentially, which are pretty nice. And also there's this little they that's I've just put on repeat here and kind of automated to increase in volume just to introduce this little vocal fill, this vocal phrase, which is the phrase that they'll never hold us back, and that sounds like this.
They'll never hold us back.
It's kind of just a good way of introducing that as a little vocal phrase. And then down in our effects, we just have this basic exhaust kind of sound, which I call an exhaust sound, and it's just basically white noise, which is kind of cool. And we also have this breath sound here, which just acts as like a little short kind of riser, which is going into the drop and also in our little fill here as well, which sounds like this. Pretty cool. And then we have some more short sweeps, some more short risers, and this little riser sound here towards the end as well. So just a bunch of little kind of white noise risers and stuff like that, just to help aid transitions and just fill out some extra space in the tune. And altogether, let's play the second half of the drop, which sounds like this. All right, cool. So let's move on to the second verse. There's not a huge amount different going on in the second verse. We have our main drums going on here, which of course have our sidechain layered with them as well. We have our same crash cymbals that we had in the first verse, as well as this kind of reverse build-up snare just to add some extra stuff going on there, and a reverse kick leading into the second half of our verse here. And then we also introduced the same hi-hats that we had in the drop in the verse, which just kind of adds a little bit of extra stuff going on in the verse just to increase the intensity and keep the energy moving. Our chords and layers and stuff are pretty much exactly the same in terms of our synths in this second verse. We have the exact same electric keys, the exact same verse chords. We've just kind of changed them around a bit, and we have this fill here, this kind of 2 bars here where the drums and everything drops out and the chords just kind of filter back up, which works really well with the vocals, which we'll get into in a second. So that little fill sounds like this.
Like them,
So it's basically just a little fill leading into the second half of the verse. And then let's go down here. We have that same bass, which again has that kind of filter movement for that fill in that, or leading into the second part of the verse there. And then we of course have our vocals. And other than that, there's not a huge amount going on. There's not any effects or anything like that. I tried to keep this pretty sparse, fairly intentionally, just so that, you know, then the drops were really impactful and what comes afterwards is really impactful as well. So speaking about what comes afterwards, let's get to the second build-up, which is pretty much exactly the same as the first build-up, just changed around a little bit. So we actually, instead of using that build synth, we use the drop synths essentially as the build-up synths. So these are playing without, you know, any kind of drums backing them or anything. So they're massive kind of hands in the air trance chords. And this is where the track spacer comes into it, because we have the vocals playing, of course, at the same time as these massive chord stabs. We have a few layers of vocals, of course, going on as well, actually. And we introduce this lower double layer for the vocals as well, as you can see here. But using that track spacer on the main synths just really helps to kind of carve some space out of the main synths for these vocals so that they don't kind of clash with each other too much and the vocals shine clear and bright over the top of these main synths here. So this verse will just, or this build up, this first part of the build up sounds like this.
And we keep running this together. And we keep running this forever. And we keep running this together. We'll never hold us back.
And you would have seen the track spacer just kind of moving there as well, carving out some little bits and places from the main synths to just leave room for the main vocals. You would have heard the drums, which are pretty much exactly the same. They're just extended out in terms of that build up, but they're pretty much exactly the same. You can see like there. In fact, I think I've even got the exact same automation. Yep. Not really too much different going on there, except we've just got crashes and stuff as well. We obviously have our basses layered with our main synths there, and our vocals, which I mentioned before, which are pretty much exactly the same as the vocals in the first build up, except for that pitched down layer, which I mentioned previously as well. And we of course have some automation and stuff on the vocals too. And then we just have a few more kind of riser sounds just to give some more energy and tension to this build up before we head into the second drop. And because this is kind of more of like a poppy, future bassy kind of tune, the second drop isn't too much different in terms of its overall elements. There's no kind of wild change ups or anything like that. There's just some extra fills, some extra elements just to keep the listener engaged and some interest kind of going on there as well. So this second drop, you'll notice that we have this kind of little bar long fill right at the start so that it doesn't come right in after the build up. There's a little bit of a gap. And then we also have a similar kind of thing going on in the second half of this drop as well. So this sounds like this. Pretty cool. You would have noticed the drums here, this little fill, we have some kind of pitching up of these pop snares just to add some extra interest and more cool sounds to this fill, which sounds like this. You would have heard the pop snares just go, which is kind of cool, and some reverse sounds just to add some extra, cool stuff. We have our basic synths going on here with the exact same filter movement for those fills. Or I have this little laser sound kind of here, which sounds like this, which just adds an extra little bit to these kind of wubby fills, which is kind of cool. You might have heard that when I played it before. It's really subtle, but it just adds a little bit of extra kind of ear candy to the track. And then we also have, of course, our vocal chops going on as well, which are pretty much the exact same as the first drop. And then we have our vocal fills and, of course, some extra effects and stuff going on here as well. So then moving on to probably what is one of my favorite parts of this tune is this little bridge section, which is this kind of orchestral bridge breakdown section. So I'm going to close up the drum group there. There's pretty much only some impacts and some crashes and stuff going on there, but there are these orchestral drums, which I just grabbed in like this orchestral kind of drum loop into a simpler, used the slice mode, and basically just jammed out on my Ableton Push just some kind of basic orchestral drums pattern, which ended up sounding pretty cool, which sounds like this. You'll notice that I set the playback mode down here in simpler to poly, which means that I can have two of these notes playing at the same time. So I can basically create some more impactful hits. So I can, when I play two of these different drum slices at once. But all of this is layered and comes in the second part of the bridge with these orchestral sounds, which are made up of a few different layers, but I'm going to play this orchestral bridge for you and then pick apart the different layers that are in it.
Our minds racing, diving into an ocean, hoping that it's all worth it, betting everything just to make it. Living it up, 'cause it's all that we've got. Living it up, 'cause it's all that we've got.
So of course we have the vocals down here, which are just doing pretty much exactly the exact same thing they've been doing the whole time. There's some harmonies added in that second half of the verse, but this main kind of orchestral section, we have a piano sound here, which is pretty cool, which I played in. I just played in the piano chords on my Nord, recorded them in, and just used the audio. I didn't use the MIDI because I wanted that human kind of natural feel to these piano chords. And really, I haven't processed them at all except for the group processing that's on this orchestral bridge section, which is just some really basic EQ and reverb, because the sound on the piano on the Nord is so goddamn good. And you can see this going on here, it goes throughout the whole time, and it sounds really nice. Sounds like this just by itself. Really nice there. And that's layered with some strings, which are just Ableton Live string ensemble. I didn't go too crazy with this because the strings were quite kind of a background element, so they didn't need to be anything too fancy. They're just playing block chords and they're all quite quantized and everything, so that's just is what it is. And they sound like this. We'll play the second half. And I'm doing some stuff with the velocities there just to, change it up and make it a little bit more natural as well. Then we have this piccolo, which kind of is not really high enough to be a piccolo. It's kind of more of a flute, but still there anyway, which sounds nice. And it's basically playing the melody line of this orchestral bridge section, which is again just Ableton Live's piccolo there with some multi-band dynamics to just take down some of those harsher, piercing, higher frequencies that a piccolo sometimes can have. It's panned a little bit as well, and it sounds like this. And you'll notice the second half of it there, I layer it with an octave as well. And then I also bring in some brass towards the second part of this bridge too, which just, again, adds some extra texture, adds some nice build up towards the breakdown, which is coming up, which sounds like this. Pretty cool. Again, just Ableton stock brass sounds there and some bass that comes in as well, which is just that same verse bass that we've been using throughout the verses, just to add some extra weight to the low end for this section. And then, of course, we have our bridge harmonies down here, which sound like this.
Living it up, 'cause it's all that we've got.
So hopefully you can hear the harmonies in there behind everything else, and then just a kick impact, which I've just basically resampled the kick and added some intense reverb to it, and then just used a fade to control the length of this kind of impact sound, which sounds like this. Which is a really good technique. So basically creating custom kick impacts by resampling the kick, chucking a bunch of reverb on it, then bouncing it to audio again, and using fades and extra processing to control your kind of impact sound, which is quite cool. Then our breakdown is essentially the exact same as the verse. We have our verse chords here. We have the build synth comes back in, which is just playing notes or kind of like a melody in, what's that, fifths, which is quite cool, or just actually not even fifths. It's kind of like a harmonized melody going on over the top of our breakdown section here, which just adds a little bit of some extra musical sauce and spice to this. And we also, of course, have our drums, which are being quite filtered. We have some build-up drums as well, and our kick drum gets a little bit more intense towards the end of this breakdown section here. So we'll just play the last part of this breakdown, the last kind of 4 bars or so, into the pre-drop and into the, or just before the final drop. Pretty cool. And of course, we've got the vocals and stuff going on there as well, which have some layers in there. You see I've cut out the doubles here for the first part and just left it with the octave below, then introduce the doubles in the second part just to kind of add some more weight to that. So there's more of a build up over the course of this breakdown build up section. And then this pre-drop, just before the drop, we just have this kind of extra 2 bars here filling the gap between the end of the build up and the start of the drop. And we just use this to introduce the vocal chops before the drop, just as a way of, again, just changing it up a little bit. So this pre-drop sounds like this into the drop. Pretty cool. You'll notice we've introduced some more kind of percussion sounds here. We've introduced some trap hats, which actually came in the second drop, but I neglected to mention that. So essentially just some extra hats here, which sound like this. Just adding some extra movement, some extra spice, some extra kind of push forward, some momentum to the drop. And then we add in an open hi-hat to the second part here as well to keep that momentum going. And other than that, the first part of the drop here is pretty much the same. The first kind of 8 bars is essentially the last 8 bars of the second drop, but then we start to add in some extra stuff. So we add in some drop brass here just to give a little bit more weight to the sound and to the impacts, which just give it a little bit of extra movement and just a bit of extra spice and sound going on here. So this drop brass sounds like this. It's pretty subtle, layered in with everything. You can't really hear it, but you notice when it's not there. And then again, that's kind of all we've got there other than the introduction of the open hi-hat sound as well. Then we have this kind of fill section here, which is quite cool. And after that fill section, we introduce the kind of final thing that we introduce in the track, which is this drop up sound, which sounds like this. Pretty cool, and we have some obviously speaker mixer automation and stuff on there to just help clean it up as well, and so that we have some kind of gaps and stuff going on as well, which is quite cool. So all together, the final part of the drop, we obviously have some vocal layers and stuff going on there as well, and some extra effects and stuff too. And altogether, the final part of the drop sounds like this. And that's pretty much it. So there you have it. There was the track breakdown for my new track, It's All You, featuring Kathana, which is out now, and you can go stream it on your favorite music platform. This project file that I've gone through today, as well as the stems and also a high quality download, are available to all my Patreons over on my Patreon page. So if you want access to the project file and the stems and the high quality audio file for you to play around with, you can head over to my Patreon page, become a patron, and get access to all of those amazing things. But please make sure to go and listen to the tune. Let me know if you liked it, if you enjoyed this video, by commenting below. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you want to see more videos and content like this, and make sure to turn on those notifications so you never miss an upload. But that's it from me, guys. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you all in the next video.